Good evening, everybody, and a warm welcome to the Merchant Taylors Hall. It's very nice to see such an enormous audience here tonight. Some merchant tailors and other non-merchant tailors, you're all very welcome. My name's Claire Wesley, and I'm the current master of the Merchant Tailors, so it's my great pleasure to welcome you this evening and introduce our talk. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening. As I said, Alan Warren is a fellow merchant tailor, and he is former master here. In fact, he interviewed me about becoming a member here, so you can draw your own conclusions and criticise him as appropriate afterwards. Alan arrived in York in 1971, he said, for a couple of years, but like many others who've fallen in love with this great city, he's never left. He was a history professor at the University of York, and there are plenty of York connections at play with tonight's talk. Alan is chair of the lecture subcommittee of the Oliver Sheldon Trust and reinvigorated the Oliver Sheldon Lectures. Oliver Sheldon was founder of the Civic Trust and the Georgian Society and a significant contributor to the cultural life of York. He was also joint secretary with Dean Milner-White of the initiative to promote the establishment of the university in the 1950s. So I'm delighted to welcome Alan to give us his talk and show us how his subject, Milner-White, was making waves.
Good evening, everyone, and I'm told that I must make sure that I've got the thing so you're not hearing my swearing about the Master's very kind remarks. So I'm hoping that Steve has instructed me correctly. Thank you, Steve. I'm going to sit down, if I may, in this seat, and welcome you to the... Oh, I mustn't do that. Told not to do that. To welcome you in a very intimidating set of circumstances. When you are talking to an audience of both friends and those interested, it can be both reassuring that you've got some friends, often critical friends, but also very intimidating at the same time. It's not as bad as giving a talk to the old members of one's college at a boozy feast. Well, certainly in my day, I mean, when it was all male, for the fear that, well in liquor, they might start throwing buns at you if they got bored with your speech. So anyway, it is a great privilege to have you here this evening, and the Master has indicated the degree of collaboration that goes on within the city and between the merchant tailors, the university and the Festival of Ideas, the City Council, and the Sheldon Trust. And it makes the point that York is, for all of us, a very special place, and where its civic sense, I mean, has been emboldened in some ways in the most recent years, I mean, by the fact that the role of, inevitably, the local authority has diminished in terms of nurturing the life of the city simply because of the central government, all parties. So the role for these informal bodies, I think, has become reinforced in the last 15 or so years. So you're all extremely welcome, and I hope you find what I have to say interesting. Now, I need this, of course. There we go. Well, Eric Milner-White, very briefly, was the most long-serving, continuous officer in charge of two of the great churches in northwestern Europe, the chapel at King's College, Cambridge, and York Minster. In total, for 45 years, between 1918 and 1963. he also is particularly well known, and hence the title of this talk, to the one of the very few things that most members of the public might just have heard about, which is the annual Christmas Eve service of 9 lessons and carols from King's College, Cambridge, which was first celebrated at King's on Christmas Eve, December 1918, 6 weeks after the armistice. It wasn't an entirely new construct. Others had been trying to do this, but of course Christmas Eve is not a Christian festival. So it was, in that sense, a complete innovation. But it was the first of what has become a global, in the English-speaking world, celebration service, whatever you want to call it. So I'm going to just start with this only recording that I know of the spoken word by Milner-White himself, who did wholly write the wonderful bidding prayer which always starts that service.
Beloved in Christ, be it this Christmas Eve our care and delight to prepare ourselves to hear again the message of the angels, and in heart and mind to go even unto Bethlehem and see this thing which is come to pass, and the babe lying in a manger. Let us read and mark in Holy Scripture the tale of the loving purposes of God from the first days of our disobedience unto the glorious redemption brought us by this holy child. And let us make this cathedral church, built so gloriously to his honor, resound with our carols of praise. But first, let us pray for the needs of his whole world, for light in our darkness, salvation from discord and want, peace and goodwill among all peoples. Let us pray for unity and brotherhood within his universal church, and within the dominions of our sovereign lady, Queen Elizabeth, and within our royal and ancient city. And because this of all things would rejoice his heart, let us at this time remember in his name the poor and the helpless, the cold, the hungry and the oppressed, the sick and all that mourn, the lonely and the unloved, the aged and the little children, all those who know not the Lord Jesus, or who love him not, or who by sin have grieved his heart of love. Lastly, let us remember before God all those who rejoice with us, but upon another shore and in a greater light, that multitude which no man can number, whose hope was in the Word made flesh, and with whom, in this Lord Jesus, we forevermore are one. These prayers and praises let us humbly offer up to the throne of heaven, in the words which Christ himself hath taught us.
I thought this was a good way to introduce the enigma of Milner-White. When talking to the relatively few people who remembered working with him 60 years ago, I asked the question, was his way of speaking precious? Oh, yes, they said. Oh, yes. The other question I asked them was he, would you say he was an aesthete? Oh, goodness, yes, they said. So who was Eric Milner-White? Well, he was a man who divided opinion throughout his life. And that's well illustrated by two examples, both of whom were archbishops of York. Michael Ramsay was taught at school in Cambridge by Milner-White in the 1920s. As a young child, he was taught divinity. And he testifies to the enormous enjoyment that he got from Milner's enthusiasm for teaching him Scripture. Milner-White, Ramsay was probably the most distinguished Archbishop of Canterbury in the 20th century, and he kept a photograph of Eric Milner-White in his study throughout his life. And they exchanged correspondence and books and had enormous affection for one another. And Ramsay wrote an interesting little memoir after his death, which is republished at the back of my book. The other, many, many years later, was John Habgood, also a very intellectual Archbishop of York, who'd been a junior fellow at King's when Milner was an elderly life fellow of King's and would occasionally turn up at stated annual meetings. And he was asked by someone, as is John Habgood, sadly both are now dead, so I can repeat this story, is whether he, John Habgood, would like to give his comments on the impression made by Milner-White. And he declined and was pressed by the person to say, well, you could say to me, you know, it won't go anywhere, which it never did in his lifetime or in John Habgood's. And he said, well, we younger fellows thought him rather ridiculous with his mannered way of speaking and the fact that when he occasionally came back to King's Cambridge, always talking about King's as this blessed place. So you know, there's a dilemma here. What sort of man was he? Well, he didn't make life easier for the historian because he destroyed all personal papers of the entire course of his life and his family papers in the years before his death in 1963. So we have lots of documents, but they're his office papers. We only have fragments, they are important, only fragments of him. And he never wrote books of any substance, of any length, I should say. We're left, and I'm going to use this as a device, of the relatively small number of images that we have of Milner-White, which I hope will to some degree illustrate why there is more to Milner-White than 9 lessons and carols. Milner-White was born in 1884, and he came from the Isle of Wight. He was born Eric Milner, no hyphen, White. So a little different from Eric Milner-White, which sounds much grander. Explain that later. And his family were relatively prosperous in Isle of Wight terms in the 1870s and 80s. They worked in trade, in shipbuilding, and to some extent in local law, but they were definitely from the provinces. His father had been very fortunate in that he'd been privately tutored by the new teacher at the school on the Isle of Wight, which he was attending, who happened to be a cleric and a Cambridge graduate who privately tutored Henry Milner, White, to go to Cambridge, which he did to read law, as his elder brother also did. They both went to Pembroke College, Cambridge. Henry became a barrister, but didn't, as far as I know, practice. Returned to the Isle of Wight and decided to make his way in the world. And he, through a series of luck, connected with a man called Edwin Jones, who had an even humbler, if that's the right way of putting it, background than the Milner-Whites, and through the cloth and clothing trade, but who'd been a very successful entrepreneur, and he founded the first, what do I mean? I want to say supermarket, a department store in Southampton. Edwin Jones. It was there until 1929, and it was subsequently bought up by Debenhams. He was a successful man with civic interests, and through a series of accidents, Milner's father married into the family, which was short of males, and rather like the Rowntrees at some point, people who married into the Rowntrees became chief executive and chairman. So it's a familiar local story. They had done well, rapidly rising to the haute bourgeois of late Victorian England. And they lived in what Randolph Churchill, the father of Winston Churchill, called, in a condescending, patronizing way, in the vineries and pineries of North Southampton, big villas, surrounded by laurels and all of that sort of thing. Not surprisingly for somebody who'd been successful, both Milner and his younger brother went to Harrow, which was a fashionable aristocratic traditional school, but also quite short of money. So it became a favoured school of the haute bourgeois plutocracy, of which Henry Milner-White was a very good example. He did well at Harrow. He was clearly an able boy. He was a good sportsman. He may well have been bullied, and his history master persuaded him that he should go to Cambridge, but not go what was intended, almost certainly, to his father's college, but compete for a scholarship at King's College, Cambridge, to study history. He won an open scholarship to King's, subsequently got a double first in history, and also one of the major university prizes, the Lightfoot Scholarship. He was a clever boy, and he was going to one of the elite, if one may put it this way, colleges in Cambridge. King's, Trinity, and St. John's in Cambridge regarded themselves as at the top in that hierarchical world. It turned out to be one of the most significant early turning points, of Milner's life. and he remained connected with it for the rest of his life in one way or another. One could spend a lot of time talking about him at Cambridge, because there he is in an elite college before the First World War. Those of you who know anything about the history of Cambridge know that people like Lytton Strachey and Maynard Keynes and a whole series of what subsequently became Bloomsbury types were either at Trinity or at King's. And many of them were what became part of a secret society in Cambridge of the most eminent sort, called the Apostles, who are very well featured, overly featured in the history of Cambridge, because of their later connection with the Bloomsbury group of artists and writers, etc., etc. Milner was never invited to join, where he had everything that would seem able, handsome, as some people saw him, a good sportsman, with attitude, etc., etc. And the reason why is that he never varied from one of the unique features of his family, which unusually amongst the commercial classes of that sort at that time was a high church Anglican. And he never varied from that. And so as far as the people around G.E. Moore, the founder of, well, not the founder, but a very active member of the Apostles at that time, whose Principia Ethica was published, I mean, in the term that Milner went up to Cambridge in 1903, Milner didn't take any part in that. He clearly lived a rich undergraduate life, which was not described in any detail by the relatively few people who wrote little memoirs of him after his death. And one wonders why. Well, I think the answer is that he engaged in the rather richly textured world of the arts, of aestheticism, and the world of his tutor, principally, who was a man called Oscar Browning, probably the most famous Cambridge tutor of the late 19th century. Famous, infamous, who led I think could be said, multifaceted life with some elements of unpopularity, looseness, some would say, but was clearly inspirational for many, but rather shocked the world of his academic contemporaries, as he had done up until the 1870s as an assistant master at Eton, from which he had been sacked. Oscar Browning was a friend of Oscar Wilde's, a friend of George Nathaniel Curzon, the subsequent Viceroy of India, before being, he was sacked because he formed too close a rapport with the young George Nathaniel Curzon. And it was appropriate that the term before Milner went up, his tutor had been touring in some state, the whole of India, as the guest of his former pupil, now the Viceroy, George Nathaniel Curzon. So he moved in exotic circles. And he also probably moved in other exotic circles, principally those around a chap called Christopher Sale, and bibliography and fine taste and fine bookbinding, who also liked the company of other young men. Oh, not that Sale was an older man, but he liked the company of handsome young men who happened to be interested in books. Well, that's what they say. Well, no, he was. So all of that was left out. Milner became a member of an alternative small group, only probably 8 or 9 members, who called themselves the Trappists. They were entirely of King's. They obviously devoted themselves to the ideals of Trappism, i.e. silence. They came together once or twice or 3 times a term in silence. They wore robes for themselves. They were creating a kind of theological order. They gave themselves extraordinary names, usually of a Gothic or classical sort. Their head called himself Merlin, and Milner called himself Euphilas, who, as everybody in this audience well knows, was an early 2nd century Gothic bishop who was the first person held responsible for the translation of the Bible into Gothic. Anyway, relationships within this particular group became rather tense, as intense young men with religious and theological interests sometimes do. I can remember such groups 60 years later in Oxford. And it induced what I could only call a psychic religious crisis in 1905 in Milner, where he couldn't go out. He had days of paralysis in his room, details of high levels of sweating, a psychotic moment, which eventually calmed, but at the end of it, he had a vision of a street crowd in East London being moved among by the figure of Christ in the crowd. And from that, he made a lifelong decision to be a celibate priest. That never changed, and the rest is history, which I shall... I've given that quite a long introduction because it was absolutely crucial to his subsequent development. So he did become a priest. He trained at Cuddesdon. He then went to a parish in South London, in Southwark, as many ordinands did as part of the settlement movement of working with the very poor in the new diocese of Southwark, already acquiring, only been a diocese since 1905, acquiring already a reputation as being a radical centre of Anglican, broadly speaking, higher Anglo-Catholic enthusiasms. People may remember there have been other bishops of Southwark that created stirs at the time. They were making waves, just to make sure I'm talking to the theme of this Festival of Ideas. Curiously enough, after he became committed as an ordinand, it is impossible to find him declaring, whatever happened in the rest of his life, any opinion on any political, international affairs, any matter of current social interest, other than that impacted on the Church of England and his view of what the Church of England should be. He returned to Cambridge in 1912, which was, at that time, in some kind of theological turmoil, with a whole group of young college chaplains and deans who were committed to making the Church of England more sacramental. The view was that Church of England worship was a boring, Sunday-only activity predominated by said matins and a sermon. There was no Christian life outside Sunday. And those of us who were brought up in that sort of environment in the 1950s in the provinces can well remember that you went to matins and you sang or said the things, and you listened, in my case, to a Church of Ireland Ulsterman preaching. He did my confirmation classes, and it was made quite clear that truth was to be found in the Bible, in Scripture, which is not, of course, what is wholly accepted by the Catholic vision of the Christian church. And so it makes a point very early on that debates today about what does Anglo-Catholic mean are more complicated than often people say, oh, it's all to do with the Oxford movement. I'll come back to that a little later. In 1914, the war broke out, and he immediately volunteered as a Catholic padre on the Western Front, where he stayed continuously throughout the Western Front until early 1918. And, of course, he destroyed all of his records of it. Fortunately, there are a little few snippets which indicate something of the conditions of the Western Front. And I want just to read you one, if I may. This is him. Am I still talking properly? Can everybody still hear me? Right. I don't know what these gadgets do, really. This is him writing on battle, probably at the Battle of Bestubert in early 1915. Battle he writes to the then Provost of Kings, ghostwriter Montague James, amongst other things, expert on medieval glass. Battle, he said, is indescribable, unimaginable. The fresh night air was itself a rushing road like a waterfall, as 1,000 shells tore through it. The dark blue was lit up by a summer lightning flash upwards from the earth every second. The darker, motionless poplars all around the horizon were continuously silhouetted in white flame. The continuous firework of light balls went up from the German trenches, but the most awesome was the noise. We felt so powerless about those splitting cracks and roars, and of the metal tearing its way into the bodies of poor men. It shows that he'd been taught quite early on how to write. And the fact that he then later wrote that bidding prayer was as a sign of his talent as a writer of prayers. One of the features of his whole adult life, which I'll deal with now. In 1940, at the beginning of the Second World War, in May 1940, which was probably the worst moment for the domestic population in terms of fears of danger in the whole of the Second World War. The Germans had invaded. They were in the north of France. The British government, Neville Chamberlain's government had just collapsed. Churchill had just formed his coalition a few days before, and the British army looked like being captured in the northern shores of Normandy. The elderly Cosmo Gordon Lang thought that there should be a national day of prayer. This was not unprecedented. There had been others, but it needed organizing quite quickly. And it needed to be put together in a form that was not wholly Anglican, because a national day of prayer is for the nation. Churchill was not very keen. Churchill was not a very pious man. He always described himself as, he was not a foundation of the Church of England, but he described himself as a flying buttress, which is quite for a person who probably didn't know one bishop from another, it was probably fair dues. Anyway, he was persuaded by Cosmo Gordon Lang, partly by the fact that he learned that the king thought it would be a good idea. Entirely unconstitutional, of course. And and also that the king would address the empire. So it therefore became not only a multi-denominational act of national worship, but an international faith service across the globe, in India, in Australia, in the mandated territories of the Middle East. And so he came to Milner and said, could he put it together? On about May the 15th or something like that, 1940, for use on May the 26th, nationally. So Milner sat to and did it, producing something which was familiar but adaptable, and writing 22 prayers of it himself. He could write prayers. He also did again perform the same at a National Day of Prayer, largely before D-Day in 1944, where one of the prayers he used is one which is very familiar to us all, I'm sure, which is called Drake's Prayer. And you may know that as, and I'll just begin it, when thou givest to thy servants to endeavour any great matter, grant us also to know that it is not the beginning, but the continuing of the same unto the end, until it be thoroughly finished, which yieldeth the true glory. Through him who died for the finishing of thy work, laid down for his life, our Redeemer, Jesus Christ. Now, this is called Drake's Prayer because it is taken from a private letter of about 5 words written by Drake about to invade Cadiz in 1880. The prayer itself was written by Eric Milner-White. So he had a talent. Now, still on the First World War, we'll get there. We'll get there PDQ, I think. He also, on the Western Front, was one of just 20-plus priests, Anglican priests, who got a major gallantry award, rather than a service award, for conduct in the First World War. He was awarded the DSO, second only to the Victoria Cross, as a gallantry award. And there were only 20 of them, because the war for non-combatants had turned out to be very, very different and was based on trenches where priests had to be up at the front, tending both the wounded and the dead and the dying. So they were endangered as much, or those who were doing this. That DSO was awarded formally on the 1st of January 1918. There are 2 records, which I won't give both, I'll give the one he got the DSO for, which have survived, one which ought to be found in a different source. As a result of the platoon to which he was attached having lost both of its corporals. Both of its lieutenants, young men, and they had both been killed. And standing orders were very straightforward in that case. The corporal had to take over. But the platoon turned to Milner-White and said, will you take command? Will you do that? And he said yes. And he conducted them appropriately to fight further fighting and safety. And for that, he got the DSO. He was, as well as precious, and as well as an aesthete, he was also a brave man. Still uncertain what he was precisely going to do after the war, the problem was solved for him because the Fellows of Kings appointed him to be the Dean of Kings a few weeks later, which he accepted immediately. That he continued for the next 20 years. Now, I'm going to be, in this audience, quite brief you'll be relieved to hear, about that period. And I'm very happy to talk about it at greater length, but he was a very, very active Anglo-Catholic churchman, certainly until 1933. Anglo-Catholicism was at its most vibrant in the 1920s. They held huge congresses in London, and that will hopefully take me back and remind me that I need to be using. That is him as a young Harrovian, and this just shows the impact of kings on him. This is what he looked like 4 or 5 years later. That's kings. That's him as a young priest, rather a different looking chap. Something had happened, which I've already described, to turn that rather sort of innocent-looking 17-year-old into a young Anglo-Catholic, thick white collar, please notice, hair parted in the middle, the sign, they're both uniforms of an Anglo-Catholic priest. And those of you who know the Alan Bennett sketch in Beyond the Fringe, where Alan Bennett plays the High Church Anglican, and it starts with that wonderful rendering by Alan Bennett, which is not taken from Milner, but taken from a man in Oxford at the time, who was the chaplain of his college. And he starts like this. This is Alan Bennett. My text this morning is, for Esau was a hairy man, but I am a smooth man. So it had an echo, and this was, of course, when Milner was just still alive. That was Oscar Browning, the louche college tutor extraordinary. And he, when he taught Milner, was 66. Milner was one of his very last pupils, and they clearly got on. Their correspondence, which was not destroyed because it's in his correspondence, Browning's, was, I think probably the best way of calling it was skittish, between this 18-year-old boy and this 66-year-old notoriety, I think. This, on the other hand, is a senior army chaplain, looking rather different. This is the only thing of Anglo-Catholicism that I show. These are the congresses, large processions through central London of Anglo-Catholic priests with all of their bits and pieces. And that, I think, is somewhere in well, you can see Joe Lyons is opposite. It's in the Aldwych or somewhere like that, processing to filling the Albert Hall. There were 3,000 or 4,000 of these people on these jamborees, and they continued until 1933. Now, I'm introducing him to remind us about Michael Ramsey, just to remind you that he was ultimately was a young priest in the 1920s, and he was an acquaintance, continued to be a friend. One of the things, the themes which runs through this whole period of Milner's life is stained glass. And there is, and the most distinguished scholar in the world on stained glass in York Minster is terrifyingly sitting in the audience. But stained glass is restoration. I want to illustrate to you churches that Milner decided upon rather than restored. And this is one in Southampton, which was paid for by Milner and his widowed mother in memory of his father, who died in 1922. And Milner was therefore entirely responsible for the stained glass. This is the sort of glass that he liked. Not exactly fashionable after the Second World War. At Coventry Cathedral, for instance. It tells you, a narrative of Southampton, so it's got a civic dimension of telling you the history of Southampton with also some sacred elements. One of the things that Milner did, he was a notoriously shy man, apparently, which is strange for a chaplain, but where he extolled and became a different person was at the annual camps that he ran for the choir school in King's throughout the war, interwar period, modelled on the Scouts, for which he became an enthusiast before the First World War in the south of London, and run on largely Scout lines. Notice the sort of rather tweedy version of the Scout uniform with stockings and garter tabs and tweedy shorts. And he gave names to all of the leaders of these camps, of which he was not Arcala or Skipper or whatever he might have been called in the Scouts, but he called himself Arch and gave all of his helpers clerical titles and ran it in that way. And this is one of the very few unstaged photographs of Milner at all, taken by one of the very few ladies who ever attended these camps. So you've got a man who becomes a sort of college phenomenon, lampooned by the students in their journal called Basilian. Here are some examples. This is the student newspaper, well known by the Dons, announcing a new college play called Vive l'Entreprise, whose first scene is advertised as portraying the Reverend Milner-White and his coterie have promised to appear as the 12 plagues of Egypt. Or a spoof elegy in a suburban churchyard with Milner introduced as through the wheezy call of the incense-breathing dean. Or finally, in a series of clerihews, Milner-White looks well by candlelight. That's why we have our services high. The 1930s were a stale period, and where he was pretty largely, I think, became stale and bored and stuck. He was a wealthy man in his own right through inheritance. He was approaching comfortable middle age, and he was probably depressed. And the war, of course, made Kings even more isolated. The call that had come from Cosmo Gordon-Lang was the opening of an entirely new and unexpected chapter in his life. By chance, Cosmo Gordon-Lang, in late 1941, had a chessboard of patronage to make. The Bishop of Southwark was failing, not surprisingly, as bishop in one of the most heavily bombed in London. There were various appointments, all of whom were made in those days through the Prime Minister's office. So the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, ultimately had the stay before passing it on to the King. The chapter of York wrote to Cosmo Gordon-Lang and said Dean Bate was ill, Dean of York, and might well die, and they might have a vacancy, and they'd need help. And he suggested that Canon Ball, he was called, he'd been a canon since 1911, lifetime appointments in those days, and he suggested that Canon Milner-White might have the sufficient talents to do that. It was a risky choice for somebody who'd never done any parish work, never done anything in a diocesan responsibility, never been outside Cambridge since 1903. You thought, well, goodness me. Churchill would not have known any of the other candidates who were clerics. Well, so was Milner-White, of course. But he will have remembered the National Day of Prayer as a thing where he met this chap processing up the steps of St. Paul's Cathedral along with the King and the Queen at the national ceremony on that day. And he probably, this is Churchill, also remembered that Milner-White was a Harrovian like himself. Milner-White was offered the job and accepted immediately. Now, I became the Dean of York for the next 22 years. A risky appointment, but one which was a surprising success for both the city and for Milner himself. He became passionately committed to the city of York. And he was able to do this for complicated reasons, but largely because this man, Alderman J.B. Morrell, was probably the most powerful councillor on York City Council between 1920 and his death in 1963, a few weeks after Milner's own death. He was leader of the City Council, and he was a visionary for York, producing a book privately printed by him in 1940 called York, City of Our Dreams, which is essentially an attempt to sketch what he thought York should aspire to be post-war. And he saw this cultivated man coming to York and he thought, Morrell, this man might assist in my vision. I'll do the drains and the education and the public highways, but he might be my ally for preservation, beauty, erasing the heritage structure of the city through the ways that I've expressed it in City of Our Dreams. Milner and he got on very well. This congregationalist, provincial congregationalist, machine politician in York, they were very, as it were, incompatibly compatible. And because it was wartime, there wasn't a lot for Milner to do in the Minster. All of the stained glass had been removed. There was obviously restrictions on rationing and travel, etc., etc. But Morrell said, look, you could join an ad hoc committee of the City Council to sketch a desire list, really, of what we would like, we the city would like, the city to be after the war. So this was a non-political person joining a team that was largely made up of politicos, councillors, who all gave papers. But Milner wrote the final report in his own distinctive way. Now, he wasn't very interested in civic services, but Morrell wanted the city to be a modern city, but also one in which one could take pride in its past. And Milner was ideal for this because he could take, this was his strength, that he could take an idea that was not his own and turn it into something much bigger than the original idea was. He did that with the 9 Lessons and Carols, and he did that for the city. And he did it in particular ways which had both strengths and weaknesses. He did it by being the great ally of this man, ally of Morrell, who had been keen to establish the civic trust in York, which he effected in 1946. Again, a non-political body with influence. So it was entirely appropriate that the civic trust should try to engage Milner-White as another person who had the benefit of knowledge of the city. The Civic Trust was founded in 1946. Surprise, surprise, but Morrill was its chairman. Sheldon was its co-secretary, and Milner-White was his other co-secretary. So he immediately became an insider. The citizens of York no blame on them, could hardly distinguish from Milner as the Dean of York and Dean as influential in the Civic Trust. So Milner essentially defined in his own way an answer to a question that was exercising the Church of England at the time. What was the point of cathedrals? And the answer that they came to at their Dean's Conference was not much. They had nothing to do except run the services. And Milner essentially, and this is my phrase, invented the concept of a civic dean, an amalgam of the civic and the ecclesiastical to work in that particular fashion. And his particular contributions in York was, again, to take a civic trust initiative to bring a university to the city. And secondly, to refashion its art gallery. And thirdly, to be a lead in the preservation and heritage of the city. And which he did in two principal ways, and at which point I shall pause, you'll be pleased to hear, at that point. One, whilst his restoration of the glass in the Minster was controversial, he was largely responsible for finding the finance to do it. And that meant the careful nurture of the most significant charity supporting York after the Second World War until his death throughout the city was the Pilgrim Trust. This hall benefited from the Pilgrim Trust. The Merchant Adventurers Hall did. St Anthony's Hall did. The parish churches of York did. It was an incredibly wealthy trust, and he managed it with enormous skill. And these were not foolish people. I mean, it was one of the largest charitable trusts in the UK post-war. Secondly, he chose to involve himself in the City Art Gallery, and through his personal collection and generosity, he turned it into something completely different from what it had been before, most notably by his own philanthropy, through principally his gifts of one of his antiquarian interests, which was Japanese 20th century pottery, which now features prominently in the art gallery, to his own donations, and to his contribution, which was again a civic contribution, to the development of the Festival of Britain in York in 1951, which was a collaboration between the city, made up largely of a city council, councillors to celebrate the National Festival of Britain, and one other lay member, the Dean of York. As a result, 3 great religious services took place in the Minster. The most prominent, was the Dream of Gerontius, conducted by Sir John Barbarolli, advertising Kathleen Ferrier as the principal female soloist. She was taken ill and couldn't manage it. Heddle Nash and others. Later, a performance of Verdi's Verdi Requiem, starring, if that's the right word, it would be in her case, the young Elizabeth Schwarzkopf. Beethoven's Emperor Concerto, played by Clifford Curzon. This was because Milner was quite well connected. as one of his passions was the ballet after 1931, and where Lydia Lopakova, Maynard Keynes' wife, was a ballet dancer with the Ballet Russe in 1914, and said, no one needs a choreographer in English society, because the way Milner can produce a liturgy with a choreography which is as fine as any ballet company, which he did, and his instructions for one of the successors to the 9 Lessons and Carols. He produced 2 other services of that sort. One is an Advent carol service, which many of you will attend, which is a Christian festival, and the other is one for Epiphany, which was composed for York Minster in 1947, and which contains detailed choreographical instructions as to how the whole minster should be used. All of its space and the movement of choirs and singing should be orchestrated. So that was his contribution. Later, of course, he hosted the first royal wedding in York Minster since 1327 for the present Duchess and Duke of Kent. There he took again scope for taking an idea and putting it into something else. This became not just a celebration, of the Minster, it became a Yorkshire festival, because the Duke of Kent, was marrying, as Pathé News said, a Yorkshire lass, a squire's daughter, i.e. Catherine Worsley. And so the press went into overdrive about Yorkshire, God's own county. At the initial ceremony opening the Festival of Britain had been also the inauguration of the first performance of the mystery plays in York since the 16th century, which also had, as doubtless even then a star, the first performance, public performance, as far as is known, of Dame Judi Dench in the chorus as a schoolgirl. And at the beginning, this had been preceded by a service in the Minster. This is the Festival of Britain, attended by all of the civic heads of Yorkshire, and they all processed. So this was a Yorkshire celebration. More important to many men, at least, and perhaps ladies, was that her father, Sir William Worsley, had played cricket for Yorkshire and had been captain of Yorkshire cricket in the 1920s. Now Lord Lieutenant, but also, more importantly, president of the Yorkshire Cricket Club. It was a Yorkshire occasion. And the Festival of Britain marks in some way the inauguration of that deep sense that has grown ever since, not all welcome by York citizens, that York is a place of great character, as is Yorkshire. That was also an idea transformed by Milner. So I think I've tried to illustrate that this man did make waves. He had his critics, which I'm very happy to talk about that too. He was not liked by everybody, as my evidence proved earlier on. John Habgood thought he was ridiculous. Towards the end of his time, and I can say this at the end as a conclusion, there were 2 opinions much later in his career at York, issued, one by a person who was one of the founding fathers of the university, and the other was a person, a cleric, who subsequently became a senior member of the Church of England in another diocese. For the cleric who'd worked for him, Milner was an ideal dean. For the other person, he said, Milner-White, Dean of Kings, and Queen of Deans. And on that point, I will conclude. Thank you. Sorry, couldn't keep the time.
That's all right. I don't think any of us minded, Alan. There was a lot to absorb there. Now, I'm hoping that we're not going to have a kind of history paper test, because I have listened attentively, but there was an awful lot to absorb there. I'm sure even for those of you who probably knew a whole lot more than I did about Eric Milner-White when we started. Alan's kindly said he'll answer any questions, or try to answer any questions. I won't put him quite that much on the spot. Can I start with a quick question? That's one of the privileges, isn't it, of standing up here? Whether you have a view on, given what you've described as quite a flamboyant person with, you know, lots of new ideas and new ways of doing things, why he was so private and didn't keep, you know, or purposefully destroyed papers so that we had difficulty in perhaps understanding some of his motivations?
I think I can, because I think it's related to that very early thing that I said about his exotic undergraduate career. Because he could behave extremely insensitively and domineeringly. As Sarah Brown has put it, as have others, he always knew he was right, which is a virtue in some cases. It's a natural authority, you might say. In other cases, it means that if you know that you are right, you can become a perfectionist and be destructive. And there are examples of that. Now, he would have arrived in York to find a well-established chapter, one of whom was Canon Frederick Harrison, who'd been was the Canon Chancellor, I think, at that time, and had been a canon since 1925. And he was the person who knew more than anyone else about the Minster's glass. And Milner-White, who knew a great deal about glass, particularly King's glass, which he didn't have to do the research for because Monty James had done that before, he must have relied on Frederick Harrison. But he treated Frederick Harrison rather badly. And much later on, very discreetly, Peter Gibson, who was an appointee of Milner's, and after his death, said that he felt Milner had not treated Harrison as graciously as he should. Why? Well, Harrison was an uxorious extrovert, inclined to mimicry of his colleagues. And he had, in fact, been an exact contemporary studying history at King's College, Cambridge, in 1903. They had known each other a very long time. He, on the other hand, had been at Macclesfield Grammar School, had got a third in history as distinct from a double first, and who probably knew more about the young Milner-White than Milner may have been comfortable with. That would be what I would say.
Very interesting. Does anyone have a question that they would like to ask?
They probably want a drink, actually.
Well, shall I pass the microphone? Somebody's going to come with a microphone, I think. There's a gentleman at the back.
Hello. He would have been appointed dean not long before the Baedeker raid.
I'm sorry, could you speak up, please?
The Baedeker raid, which was in 1942, the Baedeker raid when they bombed York.
Oh, yes, the Baedeker raid, sorry. Yes.
In the aftermath of that, that would have taken place not long after he'd come to York.
That is correct.
So
yeah.
Did he play much of a role in the aftermath of that?
Yes, he did. He wrote within probably a few days of the bombing a letter, an open letter to the Lord Mayor of York. But he didn't write it, as it were, from the Dean of York. He wrote it from the perspective of a new citizen of York, and where he made the point that the site should not be redeveloped for retail purposes, but restored in the appropriate way. So, and that ultimately, obviously, was the successful outcome. He also, a little bit later, there was a campaign to establish 2 or 3 new cooling towers just to the south of the city for the electricity supply, I suppose. Don't quite know. There was a lot of hostility to it. And they were a bit like the ones you see still passing on the train to London. And a number of protests. And he wrote that, in his opinion, such an idea so close to the centre would be an abomination. Not as you understand it as the Dean of York, but as a new citizen of York. Therefore, negotiating quite carefully. And they weren't built, or if they were pulled down quite quickly afterward. So he did. The answer is yes. And again, quite soon, finally, in later 1942, in one of the first speeches that he made to local audiences, as distinct from clerical audience or church audiences, was to the York Rotary Club, where he floated the idea that York was a place that had to have a university. Now again, Milner-White knew nothing about what a university was outside King's College, Cambridge, hardly representative. If you went to Liverpool or Bradford or Leeds at the time, he had no idea about the contemporary. It's one of his great weaknesses. Whilst he committed himself to the idea of a university, he didn't found it. The drive came from his leadership and the civic and other people. But he could sell the idea. So one of the most critical things, one of the critical moments, given that a new University of York came because of a change of national government policy in 1957 and 58, and York was in the frame for that. He was a supporter of the University for York, constantly raised it all the time in the previous years. So he decided to invite the chairman of the University Grants Committee, the person who would, in the end, decide where these new universities would be. He decided to invite Sir Keith Murray to come and stay in the deanery overnight before a consultation to be chaired the following morning at Bishopthorpe Palace by none other than Michael Ramsey. The civil servant commented, a very powerful delegation. So he was taken, Murray was taken up to the water tower, which won a good design award, above what turned out to be ultimately the campus, and looked down over this what was a vacant spot, really, which Morrill had bought himself, initially for a civic centre, but saw it as a way in which you'd get a site for a university. And they went up with the Milner and Murray and the subsequent registrar, John West Taylor, to whom the city owes more than a little for having a university there, and looked over this green site. And Murray wrote immediately that evening, an ideal site, pleasantly wooded, picturesque, his words, a very important consideration. So you get there a mindset which was informing the philosophy of new universities, either for good or for evil, or what. They were all situated, if you think about it, the first 6 were situated in historic towns, Canterbury, Lancaster, well, Warwick, sort of. No, well, there was an argument about that, whether there should be a technological... but interestingly, that was the idea that the one in the Midlands should be in Coventry, and it should be the University of Coventry, went against that particular ideal. So you end up with Warwick, of course, which is. So the answer to your question is, yes, he did.
I'm thinking, as we've got to sort of 10 to 8,
yes,
that people might be feeling the need of a drink, and as you've whetted their appetite so much, they might also be in need of a book.
Yes, there's a book there, and I'm here to bore you all even more,
and
if you wish to be bored.
Yes, so Alan will continue to answer questions. Thank you all very much for coming this evening and sharing this really very, very interesting evening with us. Can I say a big thank you to Alan from all of us?
Thank you.